First Sergeant Kep here with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, and thanks for joining us in the workshop. Before we get started on this viewer requested video, let me get this packing crate I made for our loaner gear off my workbench. As I was saying, we had a good comment several videos back from someone wanting to learn more about Civil War woodworking tools. And while I don't necessarily collect Civil War woodworking tools, you can see in my videos I have this large collection of traditional woodworking tools, and I know enough about the history of tools to kind of give you that background, that history, and sort of what to look for. I think it's really great to know, especially if you're interested in getting into making historical reproductions, or if you want to create an artificer impression in the hobby. That impression is really underrepresented, especially when you consider how many skilled tradesmen were required to equip, maintain these huge armies on both sides. Skilled workmen like wheelwrights, blacksmiths, and carpenters were absolutely necessary in everywhere during the war. They had their own pay scales, their own rosters. So I'm going to try to get you through that. My source of reference is the 1865 Quartermaster Manual, which lists all the government required carpenter's tools. If you are a traditional woodworker, please excuse sort of the brevity I'm about to take in this video. There's so much information here, this would be an 8-part mini-series at least, because this topic is so expansive. So, let's get started. We have number 1 on the list is a jack plane. Jack plane is a mid-sized plane in between a smoothing plane and a joiner plane. All hand planes during the Civil War would have been wooden bodied, and so this is actually a jointer plane. It's really long, so it can ride over all the irregularities as you joint a face or an edge of a board. So they all would have looked some version of this. The jack plane is just in the middle. This is a Stanley number 5, and you can see it's a little bit bigger than the number 4 smoothing plane. But like I said, all these would have been wooden bodied. You can find them all at antique stores, reasonably affordable. The smoothing planes, sometimes known as coffin planes, because some of them look like little mini coffins. They're usually like little blocks of wood with a high angle iron in it. It's kind of hard to find one in good shape, because in order to true the sole of a wooden plane, you need to use another plane and plane it down every once in a while to maintain its accuracy. Smoothing planes got used a lot, so they got planed down a lot. And eventually this mouth here, so that's on my jointer. Let me show you the mouth on my smoothing plane. So you can see how tight that mouth is. Well, on a wooden plane, as you plane it, that mouth gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it can no longer perform its duty as a smoothing plane. And so the carpenter or joiner puts a heavy camber on the iron, and it becomes a scrub plane, which is great for really roughing in rough lumber quickly. So just look for, you kind of got your 3 sizes of wooden planes. 4 plane, let's cover that. Smoothing plane, it's just the small one. 1 rabbet plane. I don't have a wooden one, but I do have my Stanley 78. So let's grab one of these. So a rabbet plane, a rabbet essentially cuts shoulders on the edges of boards, and they're going to generally they're going to be this shape, but what you notice is different on a rabbet plane is it's going to have this cutout on the side, and the iron goes flush with the side of the plane. So that's what you look for. They're fairly common to find, and you just have a little iron in it that you sharpen and take care of the wedge. Easy peasy. And some, so this is, when you have a Stanley 78 with all the bells and whistles on it, it's actually a Philister plane. They had wooden ones that looked like this with an adjustable fence. Those are handy too. Those are kind of expensive specialty joinery tools. 1 match plane, okay. So a match plane, this one is 1.5 inches. So a match plane is essentially, it's usually 2 planes, but there are these really cool ones called push me pull yous, and it's essentially 2 planes that do 2 jobs, but they made it into one solid piece. They're pretty cool, super rare, but very handy. So a match plane, so here's 1/2 of a match plane. They cut tongues and grooves, which is really useful for joining boards together. 1.5 inches is pretty substantial, so they're joining some pretty big stuff, probably like sheeting together. So this one cuts the tongue, and then you have one that's matched to this one that cuts the groove. And they want you to have one to take an 1.5 inch board. I just have 3/4 inch ones because that's mostly what I work with. And if you have a smaller one, it'll work for a bigger board. It doesn't matter if the tongue and groove is not centered on the board. The only thing that matters is that you use the same reference sides and the boards go together. 1 iron brace and 24 bits. Remember one time at an event, someone was commenting on, I don't know, some of the videos he'd seen of ours, or maybe just all the camp furniture that I made. And he's being funny, but he didn't quite get how funny he was when he asked me. It's like, man, can you imagine how nice it would have been if they had cordless tools back then? It's like, yeah, I can't. All the tools were cordless back then. And here's your cordless drill. This is a brace. It's just straight iron, doesn't have any of the fancy handles. It doesn't ratchet like the modern ones do, and it just has a thumb screw. These were often blacksmith made and often have absolutely no maker's marks, but you're looking at something really simple. They also had wooden ones that were still common back then, but the US government wanted something with a little more durability. And then you have your tool roll of auger bits. And you can get these in most antique stores pretty affordably. They're easy to sharpen if they're dull. And they are measured in 1/16 of an inch. I would say if you can find a set that's probably pre-1950, that would pretty much cover you. The topic of drill bits is, again, in itself a huge topic. This is a Jennings style bit. After like 50s and 60s, Irwin really starts to kind of change sort of the depth of the flutes and some of the styles of the cutters that kind of stand out. They also had some pretty rare bits that were much more common back then, like spoon bits that mostly only Windsor chair makers use. But something like this, a nice set, be real handy. And then another, since we're talking about like, modern stuff and how they did things back then, they also countersunk their holes. That's a snail that goes into the brace. And it's just like modern countersink bits. You hand crank it and it countersinks the hole, and they have snails in different sizes. So they were doing all the same type and quality of work back then as we do now, just with slightly different tools. So get that out of the way. 6 augers. So augers are going to be really, really big drill bits. They want 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch, 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, and 2 inches. So here's your auger. These are great for boring pins for timber framing. I mostly just use this for making log furniture. These are great for putting the legs into a log seat. This is sort of another old one with turn handles. If you're sort of a prepper survivalist a la Dave Canterbury and you're really tool centric, this is really great for your bug out tool bag, because this breaks down and then you can fit any tool bit either you find or you make in the field like that. And I got that at an antique store. So this is really nice because you can modify, but I think they're thinking like this during the Civil War. Okay. Next one, 12 firmer chisels. So those are essentially going to be your bench chisels from 1/8 on up for various sorts of work. So here's a much more modern chisel, but what you're looking for is these chisels are all going to be socket chisels. And then you just put your set together, and a lot of times the handles would have been custom made, but they did have commercial ones back then. Old tool steel is fantastic, by the way, if you get a chance to get into it. And then 9 framing chisels, assorted sizes. So the framing chisels are going to be big chisels like this slick, and they came in all different sizes. Great for timber framing, and also just like really hogging out a ton of wood really quickly on a piece. You'd be surprised at how often you can end up using some of those big chisels in a shop. I mostly use my framing chisels for my spring pole lathe. And then 3 gouges, 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch. So like that. Again, it's another socket chisel. And sometimes you'll have a ferrule on the end so you can get beat on a little bit. Then we have a claw hatchet. I don't have one in here. Essentially, you're looking at a crate axe for opening crates. 1 draw knife, one of the most underappreciated tools in a wood shop. I have a couple of these. These are great for any number of things in a shop. I use them to make paddles, spoons, tent stakes, and you can use, a lot of people in timber work, they'll use it to remove the bark off a tree. I think using a spud, a bark spud would be a lot more efficient and less brutal on a tool, but whatever. 1 claw hammer. So yeah, claw hammers are actually very old. They had them during the Revolutionary era. Going to be something similar to this. This is like a 40s, 50s Cheney hammer. You're going to be looking at sort of like this cone-shaped head, probably blacksmith made, or you're going to see in some of them. Something like that. And then you'll also notice that the old hammers have a really steep claw on them. Unlike today's modern framing hammers, for example. Then, let's see, you got a claw hammer, cast steel, oil stone, Arkansas stone. You got to sharpen all your tools. 1 riveting hammer, number 3 cast steel. That's essentially going to be like a ball peen hammer. 1 hand cold chisel, cast steel. It's just going to look like any modern cold chisel. 1 hand axe. They don't specify, but one thing people don't know about is for the longest time in history, the carpenter's #1 tool was their axe. This is my Wetterlings I keep on my bench. You'd be surprised at how often you can actually use a hatchet for woodworking. And then you could also maybe even consider having what we know today is a shingle hatchet. So you have a bevel on one side and it's flat on the back. It's great for hewing. I have one of those by my spoke shave, or not my spoke shave, my shaving horse. 2 tri-squares, 6 and 10 inches. So when they say tri-squares, we want to think these machinist squares. This is definitely, you know, kind of post-war. But during the Civil War, just these little tri-squares. And don't stress, like if you find one and it has no numbers, the 20th century, 21st century have is so preconditioned to have increments marked on things. But during the Civil War, they just wanted to know if their piece was square and true. So you'd have a 6-inch and a longer one for longer boards. They just had to be perfectly square in all their dimensions. There are still modern manufacturers that make these. I think there's an English company, they sell products at Woodcraft if you want to buy a brand new one. Pretty common to find at antique stores, and then you just use a modern known accurate square to square it up if it's out of square. There's some pretty good videos out there on how to square squares. 6 gimlets, sorted sizes. I actually don't have any because I don't use them, but essentially a gimlet is, it's kind of like this awl, and so it'd be about this size, and on the end it'd be like a little corkscrew, kind of like a little mini auger on the end, and those those drilled pilot holes for whatever fasteners they were using, and they came in different sizes for different fasteners. You can find them on eBay. I rarely see them in antique stores, but they are handy if you need to use them. One mallet, dogwood, 7 pounds. That is a big mallet. They're using dogwood because, like elm, dogwood has an interlocking grain, which makes it not only dense, but also really, nearly impossible to break. And this is going to be probably for driving in pins and anchors and stuff like that. 6 braddles, handled. So this is just like a cheap modern one. You would have one made out of steel, and handles would be, you know, made by the Carpenter most likely. You can find these anywhere in antique stores, or you can make your own. There's lots of YouTube videos on how to make them. 1 steel square, 2 feet. That is just going to, it's just like a modern framing square today. It's just going to be, the steel is going to be different. It's going to be a little more faded over age. 1 spirit level. So here's like my little torpedo. Doesn't specify how long they want it to be, but it would just be a wood body instead of this plastic composite nonsense. And there's videos out there on how to restore them, so if they don't have any fluid in them or whatever, you can find those at antique stores. 1 panel saw. So panel saw is this. So the difference between a panel saw and a handsaw is about 6 inches. Panel saws are going to be smaller, typically cross-cut, and 20 inches. Really handy. And what's nice about these is these are the ones that are going to fit in your toolbox and most likely be at within hand's reach for a carpenter. And we have a panel saw. We have a Tenon Saw, 14 inches. Unfortunately, I think most people are going to recognize this as like a miter box saw. Tenon Saw, that's going to be long and rectangular. It's usually going to be deeper. Sometimes they can be even longer than this. They're almost always going to be rip cut because you cut a tenon along the grain, and they're going to be generally brass backed with a wooden handle. And 1 crosscut saw, 26 inches. So now we're looking at a full hand saw. And you can get these at any flea market. You don't have to be fancy about a brand, just a typical crosscut saw. And 1 rip saw, 26 inches. So if you are a joiner or a carpenter, again, it's 4 saws. You're gonna have your bench saws, like a dovetail saw and a crosscut saw. Although some will cut their teeth on their dovetails, all their bench saws to rip because the TPI is so high that it doesn't really matter. But this is a rip saw, because you always need a crosscut and a rip for going along the grain. This one's really aggressive, and you can see that the teeth here are at 90 degrees because these work like chisels to kind of chisel the wood out of the kerf, whereas a crosscut is cutting the grain across the grain. So you need to have 2 of these. I think this one's probably like a 5 TPI. They still make them. I have a 7 TPI one. This one, I got this one at an antique store in Wisconsin for $5 and just spent an hour taking the rust off and filing and setting the teeth. 1 saw set. So there's a ton of varieties out there. All a saw set is a little plunger and an anvil, and it bends the teeth to whatever you need it for. So hardwoods are going to be different from softwoods. Green wood's going to be different from dry wood. And just, yeah, so it sets the kerf so the saw doesn't bind and you can clean out the cut. Really important to have. One thing I'm surprised they don't have on here is a jointer for a saw. You can get these for like $5 in antique stores, and it'll hold a file so you can file the tops of the teeth equally flat when you tune them up, and so that way you can file them and they'll all be the same height. Because sometimes you might break a tooth, bend a tooth, might wear out, wear differently. 2 screwdrivers, 3 and 8-inch blades. It's just going to be a screwdriver with a wooden handle. 1 pair of compasses, 6 inches. So useful. These are bigger than 6 inches. Great. I use this for as fine as pacing out dovetails. Super handy. I use it for all sorts of projects. If you know how to use a compass, you can cut out all the math and all the measuring, because you just set your dividers and pace everything out, and it's whatever space it needs to be. It doesn't matter if it's like some crazy, 30 seconds. 12 saw files assorted. So 12 saw files that's a lot. So they are planning on doing a lot of saw sharpening. So they have all different sizes. It's just a triangle file. They have some really fancy pants saw files out there, but you can get these at just about any hardware store. 2 wood files, 10 and 12 inches, half round and flat. They have those everywhere today. 2 wood rasps, 10 and 12 inches, half round and flat. You can find those everywhere. A pair of pincers and a pair of pliers. We still have those today. You could probably do like a Google image search for what they would have looked like. I think they would have looked more like tongs, like blacksmith tongs then, and sort of like the modern ones we have today. 1 spoke shave. They would have been wood bodied, most likely like this. This one's an adjustable one. They probably would have had the older ones that had the wedges in it that you would have to tap to adjust the depth of the iron on it, but it would have been a wood handled one. And you can pick those up everywhere. And 1 screw wrench, 12 inches, railroad. I'm thinking for that one, they're talking about a monkey wrench, screw wrench, and a 12-inch one for nuts, like you would have on a railroad. 1 bench screw, 1 bench vise. So ways to hold your work pieces. 1 grindstone with crank complete. That was actually a whopping $55 in 1864. So this is sharpening axes and like your timber framing tools. 1 thumb gauge. So I'm thinking what they mean by that is this, a marking gauge. You have a pointy bit on one side. You set your depth or your distance here, and you run a line. And if you want to get a little fancy, you'll get the one with the adjustable tenon markers on the back. So you set that to your chisel, and then you can lay out your mortise and your tenon, as well as your depth from the edge for your mortise and tenon. And they still make these, and they look just like the originals. And you can pick them up at antique stores, usually really cheap, because this is like the most, I think this is like the most misidentified woodworking tool out there. Chalk line and chalk. Carpenter still use that today. A lot of times they would have had these really neat wooden bodies, as opposed to like the aluminum and plastic ones you get today. And then 1 quart can for oil for lubricating all your tools, keeping the rust away, oiling stones and stuff like that. One thing I'm surprised that's not on the list is a plumb bob. I imagine they would probably have one of those nearby if they wanted to set walls or something. Other than that, I think that kind of covers just about everything. Let me know if you have any questions. I know one of the most common ones that I get is, well, what about sandpaper? Didn't they have sandpaper back then? It's like, yeah, they had sandpaper during the Civil War. In fact, sandpaper is actually pretty ancient. I think ancient Egypt had sandpaper. But what's really changed is our knowledge of tools and how to use them. A smoothing plane is going to beat sandpaper every single day. And in fact, a smoothing plane can actually smooth wood so smooth that depending on the wood and the finish, you actually have to abrade it, because the finish won't soak in because the smoothing plane got it so intensely smooth. So the tools they were using, they didn't need to sand anything. If they were finishing like fine cabinets, they would use a cabinet scraper, which is just a card scraper held on the handle. These are great because it doesn't matter which way the grain's going. So you would use this for really figured woods, whereas a hand plane would just tear it out no matter how well tuned it was. And this saves a lot of the elbow grease of hand abrading back then too. So like I said, this isn't exhaustive. I hope this helps you on your journey of curiosity about Civil War tools. Thanks as always for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and thanks for sharing this video, and we'll see you next time.